Okay, so as I mentioned, we are going to be talking in just a moment with the leader of the United Nations Development Program, Achim Steiner. I think he is going to be coming on any minute now, so we're waiting, I think, about 5 seconds. I have a number running off in front of me, so we're very excited about that. Let's see if we're coming up on the screen. Ah, here he is. Here we are. I'll get out of his way so you can see him. I'm sit in this seat over here. Hello, Mr. Steiner. Thank you for joining us for this event. Everybody's really looking forward to hearing from you. I'm going to start off with for sort of general introduction. I mean, I think that we all heard the Secretary General's address to the General Assembly debate in terms of painting a picture of a world gone off the rails in a state of peril. You focus on a lot of the key issues that he is interested in, including development, poverty, sustainable development goals, all of these issues where the UN and the international community seem to not be on track. So maybe you could help me and our audience sort of paint your own picture of the kind of challenges that you're facing right now. You know, just this sense of, you know, everybody hears from every speaker at the UN how bad the situation. Is it really that bad, or do we always kind of have the sense that, you know, the world has gone off the rails? So I'll hand it over to you now, and looking forward to hearing from you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lynch, and also congratulations on your new life with Devex. And it's a great pleasure to join you this afternoon. And I think by nature, I certainly would not consider myself a pessimist, but I think when you put COVID next to conflicts, next to crisis, next to climate change, and you then look at the immediate context of the next few months, when you see the economic signals that are on the horizon in terms of inflation, escalating debt, global recession, I think it's fair to say we have some fairly rough weather ahead of us. And in many respects, the world has already been through a very rough period. COVID, the conflicts, the number of people going hungry, record numbers of refugees and displaced persons this year since 1945. I think all of these are, in a sense, statistics, but behind them lie the extraordinary challenges of surviving in this world. And I think we all know that with rising poverty levels, we are indeed seeing more and more people really struggling to not only stay in place, but they're actually losing ground. And that was also the overarching message of this year's UNDP Human Development Report, that for 2 years running, and for the first time in 30 years, the Human Development Index went backwards. We have lost progress somewhere along the lines of 5 to 6 years. And I think that is the backdrop against which we are now bracing ourselves for yet another period of extreme stress and distress. So no reasons to sit back, no reasons to be cynical or give up, but certainly we have to focus on how to get through this period.
Can you give us some sense? I mean, all of the numbers in terms of contributions to efforts along climate change, the SDG targets are not being met. I mean, in a sense, are we kind of fooling ourselves about the prospects of actually achieving the goals in 2030 that the SDGs set out to achieve? And is there sort of any kind of understanding you can provide as to why that's happening? You talked a bit about sort of issues of financial challenges. And also what, is it really practical to think about specific measures that are actually going to get there? It doesn't look like we're going to get there, but maybe you could talk a bit about that.
Well, look, neither in human history nor in the history of the United Nations would the SDGs be the first time that we may not meet all the targets and indicators on a timeline. And I think, by setting ourselves ambitious targets and timelines, I think it doesn't make the goals necessarily less valid or wrong. And I would strongly argue that, particularly at this moment in time, if you ever wanted to have a live illustration of why in 2015 there was perhaps inadvertently a remarkable amount of wisdom at work in trying to identify, first of all, what I often refer to as the great global risks to the future of humanity, to development, which in some ways were then translated into goals and that is really the essence of the SDGs. They both argue very strongly for where we need to work together as a global community, and also that we need more integrated approaches. Neither of these two fundamental assumptions or priorities within the SDGs have lost in relevance. On the contrary, the pandemic has reminded us the advent of, let's say, a cost of living crisis just now on the back of the war in Ukraine, with the explosion in global markets and prices for fuel and food. It just has demonstrated yet again how interdependent we are as a human family, as nations, as economies, but also when we have a health crisis such as a pandemic. Add to that climate change, and I think if anyone needed further reminders of the fact that we are now really the first generation that is living in the era of having to live with the consequences of climate change, then I think the SDGs remain as valid, if not more valid than ever. But it's also a fact that having had a pandemic, having now found ourselves in this extraordinary economic and political turbulence that we're in, that no, the targets and indicators will be difficult to meet, at least all of them in all of the countries by 2030. But let us, for the moment, not waste time on having to rethink targets and indicators. We have a direction, we have a timeline, we have milestones. Let's continue to work towards them because they are the right direction. And that would be my simple answer to what is obviously a more complex question you have raised.
Right. I'm sure that you've been meeting all week with world leaders, with other sort of leaders in the development community, both leadership from the North, from the South. I mean, do you get some sense of the mood this year? It's the first time we've been back in full at the General Assembly, but you see that the real focus of the North, the United States, France, President Macron, Prime Minister Truss, that they have all been focused on trying to rally attention behind their effort to push back the military advances of Russia. And I'm sort of curious in terms of the priorities of the South are often quite different. And there is sort of this sense of frustration that the SDGs are not going to be met, that climate adaptation in particular, that those funds are not coming. Concerns about world hunger, about the impact that the conflict has, debt, inflation, all of these problems. And is there a sense of tension between the North and the South? And the South feels like, the US and others are focused on their own geopolitical aims and not enough on sort of the struggles that they're facing.
Well, just in the list that you cited, I think there are enough reasons to explain why I think, first of all, as an international community, we are under stress. Secondly, the geopolitical tensions, but also growing polarization and alienation, I think I would add that word as well, are clearly visible. And having said that, I would say, first of all, the fact that the UN General Assembly is meeting this September, and we have well over 160, 170 heads of state, heads of government, and all nations represented here, I think is also an expression that the world is looking for places where one can resume dialogue and where one can begin to rebuild some of the foundations and platforms we need to get out of this mess. So I think UNGA 77 is in some ways living proof of why the United Nations is needed, but that it is not some silver bullet. It is not a magic wand that you can, in a sense, just lift. And I think the speeches from virtually all representatives around the world, whether governmental, non-governmental, private sector, clearly are imploring the international community to take a step back and rethink how we move forward from here. The difficulty is, and I, for example, attended a high-level dialogue yesterday that was convened by the Secretary General and His Excellency, the President of Egypt, with member states and heads of government, heads of state. And I think clearly what is visible is a growing level of tension. There is a growing level of expectation, but also frustration about the necessity to act and yet the lack of progress, the promises made and not kept, the opportunities that are, in a sense, palpably close, but we're not able to seize them. And clearly, on the back of a pandemic, with all the fiscal distress that many countries now face, including what we in UNDP consider to be a list of 82 developing countries that are potentially facing a debt distress situation right now, there is certainly, I think, a growing sense that we are not coming together as an international community at the greatest moment of need. And that is as true in the international financial sense. We need massive injection of liquidity to avoid the kind of crises that are now on the horizon, including the global recession. But geopolitical tensions are preventing the G20 from providing leadership, and by extension also the Bretton Woods institutions, and by analogy also our political architecture, the United Nations. So I think we need to recognize that, yes, in difficult times, it's sometimes easier to turn inwards. And that certainly is a first reflex of politicians, of the political debate sometimes. But this reminds me also of something extremely important. The United Nations, in the way that we know it today, began to be thought up and designed in the midst of the Second World War. It wasn't after the Second World War, it was in 1941, where wise people with extraordinary vision and the capacity to lead and bring people around the table together began to design the outlines of the Bretton Woods system and the United Nations. And frankly, we need desperately some of that wisdom and leadership right now to help us navigate our way through these multiple crises, because they're paralyzing us, on the back of which we have economic distress, we have climate change left unaddressed, growing numbers of poor people, and the prospect of war growing by the day.
Yeah, what would you say about the sort of state of multilateralism? And this is the biggest multilateral event. You have the largest congregation of governments coming together. There seems to be diminishing institutional trust among sort of general populations, not only in their own governments, but in the ability of the United Nations and its various agencies to do a competent job of meeting the goals that they expect them to meet. And so could you maybe talk a little bit about this issue of trust and how that is playing out, and whether there's a crisis in multilateralism, a sense that all of these governments that came up together after the Second World War are just not up to the task?
Well, let me first of all pick up on this notion of trust. And again, the Human Development Report highlighted the fact that we actually have reached a point where trust in each other, whether it is our neighbor, the institutions, government, or other countries, are at extremely low levels. And that in itself is, I think, an indicator of the erosion of confidence and belief in the ability to solve things by coming together. And that is extremely worrying, because the alternative, I think, to anybody who looks rationally at what it is we have to deal with, will very quickly show you that going it alone, withdrawing, is simply no solution. And in that sense, multilateralism is by extension equally, let's say, both an aspiration and an institutional reality that is not living up to expectations. Now, the challenge perhaps is that the United Nations was always born with an aspiration that was almost unfulfillable. I mean, the number of reasons we as human beings find to fight with each other is just extraordinary. And an institution that was meant to prevent war, to, in a sense, create the conditions for peace and peacekeeping, clearly is always going to struggle with the propensity of human beings to find reasons to become engaged in conflict with one another, the extreme form being wars. And I think yet, where else would we turn in a world of now soon 8 billion people, close to 200 nations? The United Nations still represents, in my mind, the greatest possibility to both act on the prevention mandate and to help bring conflicts to an end, including not only through peace negotiations or the deployment of UN peacekeepers, but also by investing in the prevention of violent extremism, by investing in poverty reduction, by investing also in access to electricity that allows people to not feel that they have been left behind when the rest of the world is living in the digital age and 1 billion people still don't have access to electricity. These elements all are part of a United Nations mandate of multilateralism at work. It's easy to judge us by the failures. It's more difficult perhaps to rate the counterfactual if you did not have the United Nations, if you do not have UNICEF or the World Food Programme or the WHO or the United Nations Development Programme that I had. We every day across the planet are in fact doing a great deal. But yes, in many respects, we are still not living up to the aspirations and expectations of both those who founded the UN and of the citizens who we serve today.
Let me ask you about funding. I mean, you talked about the debt crisis in the South and the developing world, about sort of issues of inflation that are placing stress on poor countries, but they're also placing enormous stress on the richest countries in the world. I mean, we have every couple of weeks the interest rates are raised by the Fed. There is a kind of retrenchment to a certain degree in terms of financing aid, concerns about whether the North has provided enough financial support in dealing with a pandemic, with the food crisis. So to what degree do you think member states are not living up to the challenge, and to what degree is this really about money and donations, and how much is it just about yours and other agencies' ability to kind of meet the challenges? I mean, is it all about money, or is it, do you need to find better ways to respond to these kinds of crises, or is it just becoming too big for everyone to deal? I mean, are we reaching a point of exhaustion and limited resources, and the problems just got too big?
Well, let me start with your last question, which I would answer with a resounding no. I think what we do have to accept, and I think what we're all adjusting to, is that in the 21st century, with the realities around us, the challenges, the needs for transformation, our energy systems and our economies dealing with climate change, the disruptions of a pandemic, clearly the challenge of managing life, whether it is as an individual citizen or as a government or as an entrepreneur, clearly have become more complex. But we also have an extraordinary array of additional possibilities, and whether it is living in the digital age, the advent of artificial intelligence, the efficiency in the way that we can rapidly develop new medicines. I mean, there are extraordinary possibilities that, in a sense, are also part of the story of our time. So I think to make an excuse that it's all too complicated, so what's the alternative? We sit back and become spectators? No. So I think what we have to address is the more systemic issues. And I think, yes, money and financing and funding are a key issue, but it goes deeper than that. It is the way we run our economies. It's the economic paradigm with which we actually address the issues with which we can either create positive futures or indeed create problems in the future. And I think here there is an extraordinary inertia that we have been struggling with, whether it's through the lens of climate change, whether it is sometimes through the perspective of poverty eradication. We often forget that we're actually the wealthiest generation in human history. We have all the money in our global economy of hundreds of trillions in terms of wealth and savings to be able to solve the SDGs, to, in a sense, put pandemic prevention in place, even to put temporary basic incomes in place. Our difficulty is that so much of our daily economic decision-making is still driven by policies that essentially reward behavior, whether as consumers or as producers, or indeed as societies, that ultimately create more problems. We don't incentivize the shifts that are needed. And that is why I think we have to go to the core of how our economic policies and paradigms address these issues. That's why the Secretary General has called for a serious effort to go beyond GDP, not to drop GDP, as some have argued, but actually to enlarge the spectrum of criteria. And secondly, also to look at how our financial system, our financial architecture can be evolved. Because at the moment, we're investing most of our money in ways that actually do not solve problems, but create more problems. And that is a product of the system.
Okay. You're right. We're running out of time, so I just wanted to sort of follow up with one last question. Essentially, you are a steward of this money, and you and other UN agencies. And I know you've taken a lot of hits in the press in the last couple of days, both in the BBC and also in the New York Times, sort of headline in the Amazon, a UN agency as a green mission but dirty partner. So there was some question about the sort of, the fact of UNDP working with fossil fuel companies while the Secretary General is and the whole UN system is fighting against problems of global warming. How do you square that with the two missions? And is that something that perhaps in terms of you would be rethinking the program in Colombia, or will you think that on balance it's worth pursuing?
Well, first of all, Mr. Lynch, I think whenever the media, has questions or writes articles, I think it is a good safety and precaution for any institution to be under public scrutiny. So when you say that, in the last few days, there's been a lot of media, I mean, we would perhaps have to put that in the perspective of UNDP at any given moment is a custodian of 4,500 projects. We have 22,000 staff worldwide working in 170 countries. So I would certainly not consider this to be a lot of media attention, but I think those articles raised interesting and important issues. or the program the documentary that you referred to. First of all, as the Secretary General, as we all in the leadership of the United Nations have stated time and again, sexual harassment, sexual abuse, instances where people experience these very traumatic, acts of violence really against themselves, is something that is incredibly troubling. And I think beginning with the Secretary General, but many of us, we are working as hard as we can to try and both make it extremely difficult for people to conduct themselves in that way, but at the same time to also invest in our staff and our training in the way that we create a culture in our organizations where that kind of conduct is simply not just not tolerated, it just cannot occur. And that is a journey that, as the Secretary General said, we haven't been able to complete yet. On the issue of working with fossil fuel companies and, the question of at what point do you declare a particular part of the economy an unviable partner, this is a longer discussion. The simple fact is in Colombia, there was a company that during COVID was putting resources up to help a community in a particular area to recover socioeconomically. We were asked to be a custodian for those funds, including with the support of the government. In the course of planning this, indigenous communities raised their concerns because of oil and gas exploration opposition. In reviewing that proposed project, we, as a result of that intervention, canceled our program. There was never anything implemented. So on that particular issue, I think there is a very clear set of facts, but nevertheless, there is a deeper discussion here that I think is worthy of having. And I'm certainly very conscious of some of the dilemmas that arise when we look at the future, where we want to be, and working in the economy of today, particularly of developing countries that rely on fossil fuel industries, are still a significant part of their economic and daily reality.
Great. All right. Thank you very much. We've run out of time, but we really appreciate your coming on and speaking to us, and all the best for the rest of UNGA. Hope it works out well. Take care. Thank you.